Hello colleagues, my name is Laura Amadori and I would like to warmly welcome you to a new episode of the podcast series Talking Migration. This podcast series is brought to you by the Innovation and Knowledge Management Unit to share insights and content from the HQ and the field across different thematic areas. At a time of growing global mobility, when conflicts or disasters strike, migrants may be caught up in ensuing crises. We heard in our first podcast in this series how migrants caught in the Libya crisis in 2011 were a trigger for the development of IOM's Migration Crisis Operational Framework, the MCOF. In parallel, answering the multiple calls from states and to better address the protection issue of migrants in context of conflicts of environmental disaster in 2014, a government-led initiative resulted in the Migrants in Countries in Crisis, the MICIC initiative. Today, we are very happy to have with us Trevor Willis, our focal point for the MICIC initiative, and Winnie Machaki, the Regional Emergency and Post-Crisis Support Officers, based in the regional office in Nairobi, to speak about the Migrants in Countries in Crisis initiatives. Very warm welcome to both of you, Trevor and Winnie. So this is part 2 of a series we will be doing on the Migration Crisis Operational Framework to cover the different aspects of the framework. To catch up with this series, I encourage you to listen to our first episode on MCOF from our podcast series playlist. Thank you for being here with us today, and a warm welcome to our presenters in the podcast series. So very happy to have you both with us. Thanks a lot, Trevor and Winnie. So we want to start with the first question, and we can start with Trevor. Trevor, thanks a lot for being here. To set the scene, we wanted to ask you, what is MICIC? What is the initiative? And how does it relate to the Migration Crisis Operational Framework?
Thanks, Laura, and thanks for having us on the podcast. So to start, the Migrants in Countries in Crisis, or MICIC initiative, and the MCOF, they share common roots. They both emerged as a reaction to the Libyan uprising in 2011, which was an event that triggered a mass displacement with over 800,000 migrants fleeing across international borders in a matter of months. And not to mention the many, many more who are unable to or chose not to leave. And this was really a watershed moment that frankly highlighted that the humanitarian space, and by that I mean states, international organizations, civil society, other key stakeholders, needed to do more to meet the needs of migrants when crisis or environmental disasters occurred. And this is because migrants often face heightened risk to their life and their well-being for any variety of reasons. They might be unaware of local resources available to them. They might be struggling with language barriers, which might hinder access to resources or even vital news or information. They might be cut off from support networks that they relied upon. Really, the list during crisis, the list of challenges and considerations that migrants might face is long and daunting. So while MCOF was IOM's response to strengthening how the organization can provide a systemic and holistic response to the mobility dimensions of crisis, on the other hand, MICIC was a state-led effort. It was co-chaired by the United States and the Philippines, with the goal to improve the ability of states and other stakeholders to better prepare for, respond to, and protect the lives, dignity, and rights of migrants who end up being caught in countries that are experiencing conflict or crisis. Following a series of inclusive global consultations, and with a working group that included Australia, Bangladesh, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, the European Union, among others, this initiative produced the non-binding MICIC guidelines. And the approach that was taken was very much which mirrored the MCOF. Both of them, they focus on the before, during, and after crisis space, and approach the response in a comprehensive, holistic manner. Through the implementation of the very pragmatic and operational 15 MICIC guidelines and their accompanying practices, states and other actors can ensure that they are building migrant-inclusive emergency preparedness plans, that they are considering the unique needs of migrants in their response, and that when the crisis is unfolding, that assistance and information is reaching all people that are in need. I know in the last episode that Andrew Lind, the Ukraine crisis coordinator, joined, so I can use Ukraine as an example to highlight just how critical this is. So in Ukraine, in addition to the nearly 6 million Ukrainian refugees that fled from Ukraine to elsewhere in Europe, the turmoil also displaced more than 800,000 migrants from other countries who were in Ukraine at the time. So for neighboring countries, you suddenly have this large, diverse population of different languages, cultures, and needs that not only now have urgent life-saving needs like food, medicine, temporary shelter, but they also may need help to get somewhere safe and be reconnected with their families or support systems. This might mean help with visas, help with organizing movements home, tools to communicate with their family and reconnect, access to information in their language, which tells them how to be safe and empowers them to take care of their own needs. And for governments that had citizens who fled from Ukraine, those governments are trying to reach and provide services for citizens who are mixed in with all of these other movements, who are spread across multiple different countries. It's a real challenge. And our colleagues supporting the Ukraine crisis did fantastic work engaging with and supporting both the governments and the people in need themselves in these areas. And these are areas where the MICIC guidelines with practical examples and practices can really show governments and other stakeholders, this is how it's been done in the past, and this is how you can do this to make sure that the response is effective. So while MCOF will highlight the various areas that we should be engaging to ensure a comprehensive response to the mobility aspects of crisis, like in the above example, assisting movements, providing services for citizens abroad, meeting health, shelter needs, the MICIC guidelines, those speak to how do you do these things in an effective, fast, and inclusive manner. So it provides practical steps and best practices on everything from incorporating migrants into emergency response systems. How do you provide emergency consular services that will enable visas and facilitate evacuations and movements? And how do you provide migrant-sensitive communication mechanisms? And once the crisis is over and the migrants are in a safe place, how do you help them then rebuild their lives? So the MICIC guidelines essentially give states, both the host country and the country of origin, a roadmap to ensure that they are meeting the needs of everyone, including migrants, before, during, and after the crisis.
Thanks a lot, Trevor. It's very important indeed to highlight how critical it is to have this roadmap, guidelines, but also spaces to exchange on good practices and concrete examples on how to tackle the issues when migrants are in countries in crisis. So this is very much needed and critical for the support of the different member states and society. Now that we understand a little bit more about the MICIC initiatives, we would like to know where are we now with the MICIC implementation and where do we go from here? What are the next steps?
Sure. Well, across the globe, our colleagues are actively working with governments and other key stakeholders to build policy which incorporates the MICIC guidelines into their crisis policy. Let me take a moment to spotlight our colleagues in Asia who supported ASEAN member states in the development and endorsement of ASEAN's Declaration on the Protection of Migrant Workers and Family Members in Crisis Situations. This declaration incorporates relevant principles outlined in the MICIC guidelines and was just adopted by all of the ASEAN member states. And so hopefully this is an example of good policy documents that are leading to better outcomes and more preparedness in the event that there's a crisis situation in these countries. Additionally, as an organization, we doing a lot of capacity building. We've conducted over 100 trainings on the MICIC guidelines in more than 60 countries around the world, helping to shape preparedness and develop localized solutions which work based on the particular needs of the region or the area. As I said, a lot of those efforts centered around preparedness. So We're really looking to build capacity of actors to help them implement migrant-inclusive emergency planning in these places. And this can be helping countries to develop their information materials in a way in which the migrant communities will engage with those information materials. They'll be able to receive it and respond to it, and it will elicit the response that is needed. It can also be helping states to use data to ensure that their planning adequately accounts for migrant populations which might be in need. If you don't know where the migrant populations are, then it's harder to shape your response around them. And finally, with our colleagues in resettlement and movements, who we are also working to make sure that governments, consulate, embassy staff are better prepared for facilitating movement of people out of harm's way. IOM has a long history and significant experience in facilitating movements or evacuations. And this is really one of the most important and impactful interventions that we can make. In terms of where we are going, well, we continue to develop new and relevant tools to help governments and other stakeholders confront modern challenges. For instance, we know that climate change is going to drive displacement in new places, in places that haven't seen a lot of movement or haven't seen a lot of crisis before. So we need to know how can we help actors in those areas be prepared. We also know that while global frameworks are helpful, responses to crises are local by nature. And, the actors and the tools and the response mechanisms are going to vary from context to context. So while the MICIC guidelines are available online in 7 languages, taking advantage of the flexibility of the guidelines and their non-binding nature, we also have country offices which are working to contextualize the guidelines to the local context to make sure that they are stronger, that they are better tools which fully leverage the resources available within the affected communities, within the affected countries. So in short, while the guidelines themselves remain the same, we're continuing to push out updated practices and materials, as you said, trying to make a space which allows for the sharing of these practices and learning from one another from different contexts to make sure that we're not only, these tools and these solutions not only speak to the challenges that we're facing in 2023, but we're utilizing the solutions and the tools that we have available in 2023 to help in these contexts.
Thanks a lot, Trevor. It's indeed very important, the preparedness approach that you mentioned, but also the localization approach, how we can turn these guidelines, tools that can be easily adapted to different contexts, and definitely the capacity development approach is very much needed. Certainly, as you said, integrating the guidelines in the policy will be the long-term approach for sustainability of all these very important work on the initiative. Now, let me turn to Winnie, because we know, Winnie, you recently implemented and been using the MICIC guidelines in the East and Horn of Africa region. So we would like to know if you can share a little bit of your experience in doing so.
Thank you, Laura, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity. I appreciate it. At the regional office that covers the East and Horn of Africa from the start, or what I would say the launch of the MICIC initiative, we were part of the rollout, both at the regional level and country level. And for a number of years now, we have been able to support the country offices directly working with their government around the MICIC initiative. I would say one way is through creating awareness on MICIC on various forums, face-to-face as well as virtual sessions, that include a half-day session, 2-hour session within different workshops or trainings on different thematic areas to bring the participating stakeholders to the realization on the importance of understanding the MICIC initiative in order to consider migrant and migrant issues in the existing disaster or emergency response structures. In these forums, when we discuss and bring out, the gaps around data, figures, understanding just, the demographic of migrants within a country, then there's the realization of a state, either as a host country or even a sending country, to relook and see how best are they prepared and can respond to migrant issues in the event of a disaster and support the awareness of that MICIC initiative. This leads to the next approach, which is mainly the capacity building. We have conducted a number of trainings at country level in Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya, where we bring mainly government officials from relevant line ministries to participate in a 3 to 4 days training to understand the MICIC initiative, its guidelines that provide practical ways for states and other actors to protect migrants. And based on the recommendations that come up after the training and way forward is discussed from the training, they're able to come up with concrete actions to take up and follow. And when we make the follow-up, then we are able to support the government efforts in adopting and actualizing these recommendations. That can be either conducting a training of trainers that leads to sustainability, whereby the trained persons are then able to train others within the departments and at various levels based on the country's context, which can go up to local level structures. Also support in the contextualizing the guidelines to country-specific context. And I would give an example. We've been working with IOM Kenya. They've been working with the government of Kenya to meet a realized gap within the National Coordination Mechanism on Migration, which has representation from almost all ministries. And we began with a half-day awareness creation session, followed by a 3 days training of the government officials from the different line ministries. And when concluding the training, they acknowledged the realization that indeed within the structures that are in place, they have not before thought about migrants and how to specifically respond to migrants' issues in the event of a disaster. Understanding the diversity of migrants and the unique nature within which they would be affected in a disaster, And a few weeks after the training, the National Coordination Mechanism on Migration, in collaboration with the National Disaster Management Unit, came back and requested IOM, we need your support to help us in reviewing this existing document, which is the National Emergency Response Plan, to ensure it's migrant inclusive. And that process, they have taken it up, bringing together various line ministries that represent different sectors, with officials from different levels and other stakeholders to participate and provide their views, such that in the event there is a disaster within the country, the migrants are not left out and their vulnerabilities are identified and reduced beforehand. That, I could say, is one good practice ongoing, where I have seen various levels of government officials from senior to technical working together in ensuring the document is reflective of all areas and aligned within the existing government structures that would respond both to citizens and migrant needs.
Thanks a lot, Winnie. It's truly very interesting what you have brought to us, especially the example from the Kenya government and their realization on how they actually needed to review their plan to make it more inclusive to migrants. I can imagine that during the process, a lot of questions might have emerged on what does that mean, for migrants women or for migrant children or for other affected populations. So this work of awareness raising, capacity development is so needed and important. So talking about awareness raising in terms of the MICIC initiatives and the benefit of creating awareness, can you maybe elaborate more on how has it helped to address some of the mobility dimension of crisis outlined in the MCOF? Thanks.
Thank you. When we talk about benefits, and I would start by looking at just the ability to bring various stakeholders together to reflect on migrant issues and the protection of migrants in the event of a disaster. And then being able to have that realization of the gaps that exist, and this leading to an interest by the stakeholders to work on these gaps is a benefit by itself. And whether it's just looking at the migrant needs and their vulnerabilities or the mechanisms in place to support them, the gaps around data and various other information that would be relevant within a country, or even the mapping of migrants' locations and the overall strengthening of the coordination mechanism, then it supports in enhancing and strengthening the migrant inclusive nature within a disaster response. Where targeted and we can say proactive measures are put in place to assist diverse populations, including to raise the awareness, to build the capacity of the response personnel, and actively include migrants in emergency management planning, then it's all that in itself supports in ensuring that migrants are protected. And this leads to ensuring, effective coordination where the preparedness, the response, and the post-crisis actions are migrant inclusive. That in themselves, they are aligned to MCOF, the comprehensive approach to addressing mobility dimensions of crisis, as well as they are adjudicated within the phases of a crisis. And overall, working towards reducing the migrant vulnerability becomes the main objective, which, as we now understand, is largely dependent on their living conditions and access to services and resources in normal times. So a whole of society approach that include migrants regardless of their legal status will not only enhance emergency planning, but also empower migrants by enabling their participation in decision-making and reducing discrimination that they may face, and ultimately providing a comprehensive approach or a holistic way to addressing the mobility dimension of crisis, which then remains an important component of good migration governance and a contributor to sustainable development when looking at the nexus. And that overall comes out as a key benefit to the MICIC initiative. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Winnie. Yes, indeed. I mean, preparedness is a lot and can really mean, the difference between life and death for, thousands or even millions of people. Because if you have a comprehensive approach, inclusive planning ahead definitely helps in terms of response, especially in times of crisis. Thanks a lot for that. Now, before we close, I wanted to pass to Trevor again, and maybe to share with us, where can colleagues learn more about MICIC?
Yeah, sure. So you can always reach us by email with any questions. The email address is micicsecretariat@iom.int. We also have our website, which I think we'll share the link with afterwards, which is micicinitiative.iom.int. And for IOM staff, maybe the best resource is you can search and pull up our public MICIC SharePoint. And there you can find tools, resources, trainings, and information. We've also put out a 2-pager on MICIC and MCOF, which better explains the connection between these two important frameworks and how they really speak to one another and go hand in hand. We're going to be putting out more of these 2-pagers around MICIC and other key areas, which will hopefully help, make connections and help demonstrate how MICIC can be a tool for implementing and meeting other areas of priorities. I would say if people are listening to this and you're not familiar with MICIC and you want to know, where do I start? I would encourage you to take a minute and just read the 15 MICIC guidelines. They're very short and very readable. The broader guidelines are available on the MICIC website, and that will help you understand kind of the frame of reference of the entire profile. And if you have a few more minutes after that, maybe you can read the corresponding practices, which are on that same publication, and they're listed below each guideline, and that'll highlight some critical ways in which different actors can be engaged to be part of the solution in supporting migrants who get caught in crisis.
Thanks a lot, Trevor and Winnie. This has been a very interesting conversation, but we are not done yet with our podcast. We actually reached one of the most exciting parts, which is the rapid fire question. These questions are very quick ones, so that, require just your quick answer. As these are a bit unconventional questions that we want to share with our participant and host in the podcast series, just to know you guys a little bit more on a personal level. So let me start with Trevor. The first fire question. So we want to know, Trevor, are you more a thinker or a doer?
I think important to be a bit of both, right? But I suppose I would definitely lean more towards being a doer. I think it's critical to try things even if you fail, and you move things forward in small ways. You learn, you adjust, and then you move it forward in a small way again, and before you know it, you go pretty far. So that's usually my approach.
Thanks, Trevor. We definitely need actions nowadays. Now over to you, Winnie. What are you, thinker or doer?
I'm both. A bit of both. though I tend to lean towards solving problems. So I could say a doer. You find your way as you solve the problem and make mistakes and go on until you get to solve the problem. So yeah.
Thanks. And definitely in time of crisis, you definitely need to think very quickly and do very quickly as well, right? Now, second fire question. What advice would you give to someone in the first day, at his first day at IOM? Back to Trevor.
I would say, I think it's important to take advantage of being new. Don't be afraid to put your hand up. I think it can be intimidating at the start, trying to just get your head around the 1,000 acronyms that we use. But it's easier at the start to ask questions about everything and to want to learn about different areas, of operations. So I really think it's actually a pretty valuable time. And I think having outside eyes is a really valuable thing for the program. We do a lot of things on autopilot, and it sometimes takes someone new coming in and saying, but why do you do it this way? To trigger, innovation and improvement.
Yeah, definitely. We need some fresh eyes and some unconventional question also to be shared with us. And what about you, Winnie? What would be your advice?
To take it slow, breathe in and breathe out. You're coming into this giant organization that has so much happening at the same time. And it can be overwhelming and probably frustrating if you're not learning as fast as possible as one would put as an expectation. So taking one day at a time. Yeah.
Very good advice indeed. Now the third and last fire question. This question I actually like it a lot. So what is your most important wish in this life, Trevor? What are you longing for? What should absolutely happen for this life to be truly fulfilled?
You're ending with a really big question, Laura. I think in everything I do, everywhere I work, everywhere I live, I'm always just trying in whatever tiny way to make a positive change, to make things a little bit cleaner, to give people opportunities, to ease somebody's burden. And I think that carries over. So hopefully those little things add up. But I think I'd be fulfilled knowing that I at least left things a little bit better than I found them.
Very nice to hear. Now over to you, Winnie. What is the most important wish in this life?
This got me thinking. I think it's where able to empower, enlighten, and inspire whoever it is in my own little way in the different areas of my life, both social, career, professionally, and in all aspects of my life. So if I'm able to empower someone, inspire them, and enlighten them, I'm fulfilled.
This is so beautiful. We definitely need inspiration. And with that, I really would like to thank you both. And we definitely got some great inspiration through this podcast. I personally learned a lot, and thanks a lot for being here with us. And thanks for all the listeners to be listening in. And just before we close, as Trevor already mentioned, there are some resources that you can look at, including the MICIC guidelines webpage and SharePoints on MICIC and MCOF. But if you want, there is also the community of practice that you can join on MCOF in POEM, the Peer Exchange and Learning on Migration platform. You can look up different good practice and lesson learn in POEM, daily in POEM.iom.int. So we really encourage you to take advantage of all these resources. And with this, thank you very much for being here and for inspiring us so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.